So part of the play is to invite us to look at things with that beginner's mind, which is connected to mindfulness, of course, and centeredness, but how we approach things with a different mind so that I'm challenging those stories and assumptions I have about myself, I have about you, you have about me, right? Think about the listeners here, right? We all have stories now created already about what I'm saying, about what you're saying. We all have stories. How do I interrupt those?
First question I had for you is with everything in your bio, everything you're doing, how do you find time to even visit with us today?
Because you're wonderful. And I love talking to people about this work. And I love people who also recognize that my dog, who, yes, Queen Amygdala, just came back from a 2.5 week trip. And she, most dogs, like you kind of want that welcome and they kiss you, that welcome home. She literally ran by me 3 times and she wouldn't look at me for about 20 years. So mad at me. So mad at me.
I'm sure she'll get over that fairly quickly this afternoon, evening. So I hope so anyways.
So thank you again, Belinda, for joining us. So you and your company, Hummingbird, bring together this wonderful combination of academic research with real world coaching and consulting. Can you share with us a little about the journey that has taken you to where you are today and the work that you're currently involved with?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, boy, how much time do we have? No, I think a lot of, folks and colleagues that I work with, engage with, probably would have a very similar answer in that nothing's fully ever planned. As one of my dear coaches, he talked about the squiggly career in many ways. And so I think that's been both a combination of a lot of luck and a great deal of being very fortunate to be around some incredible mentors and colleagues and just people who have supported me along the way. It sounds really cheesy when I say that, but it is actually very true. And so being able to really kind of merge a lot of my interests, both I've always sort of sat in the in-betweens, like my whole life, I think, has been the in-between, whether it's in between cultures, whether it's in between, spaces of whether it's the corporate world and that the academic world. I've always sort of, I always say, when you don't belong anywhere, when you're raised sort of kind of where you don't belong, you end up belonging everywhere. And so that's sort of what I've always embraced, is just sort of being comfortable in that space in between, and not willing quite probably my need for a lot of different interests and things like that, and short attention span, that all helps in terms of not willing to give up too many things quite yet.
I would assume that allows you then to be able to fit and fill spaces with a lot of different types of organizations and people as well. So my guess is it serves you incredibly well in the work you do.
Yeah, I think in some ways it's not easy, and I'm still trying to figure it out. I'm still always trying to figure out what I want to be when I grow up. And I do think there is sort of space and need for all types of individuals in terms of, for some folks, and I've always admired those who really know where there's that one thing that they just grab onto. And I have such admiration for that. And I remember when I was younger, I thought that's what I need to do as well, grab on that one thing. And I just couldn't do it. It just didn't quite feel right to me until I really started to appreciate how we do need every, different pieces. And so even though at sometimes I'm still trying to work through that, but more and more it may seem disparate, but there's so many dots. And one thing I love doing, and this kind of perhaps aligned with that spaces in between, is how do you connect the dots? Because the academic world and the corporate world we think are so different, or C-suite leaders versus, these young activists that I just came off this 2-week trip of. You think they're different, but we're not. We're all dealing with such similar struggles and fears and issues. And it's how do we connect the dots, not just amongst people, but also this greater world in which we live in.
Well, a major focus of the work that you do with students and clients revolves around this concept of a compassion strategy. Can you tell us a little bit about what that is exactly?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because the word compassion has always been in some ways part of how I grew up, but not really understanding what does this mean. And I think I probably always, and I'm, kind of continue to investigate. A lot of times there's this understanding that compassion is this, as I say, soft, squishy concept of like, okay, we're all, going to go meditate on a mountaintop and be friends forever. And while I would love to have us all be friends forever and play dogs all the time, I think in cartoons, but, I think one of the key pieces, as we know right now, whether it's, the state of politics, whether it's the state of our environment, whether it's the state of race relations, all of these things that are very real. Compassion, and as we now understand more from the neuroscientists who are studying this, it's not just sort of a nice to have concept or this sort of fluffy thing, but a very real neurobiological sort of skill that we should all cultivate so that we can acknowledge the good, the bad, the ugly that is in front of us, not shy away from us, but still be able to show up with humanity and show up with really applied empathy, right? Empathy in action towards, again, not just human beings, but of course, all the other sort of beings that we inhabit, and everything that we do impacts others, and all of that.
Absolutely. And one thing that we'd love to do is kind of dive more deeply into the components of your compassion strategy. The first is centeredness. What is that exactly? And why is it difficult for so many leaders?
Yeah. So centeredness, it's interesting because this is a phrase that Bain actually sort of started to use, and I like alliteration, so the 3 C's. But really when we're talking about centeredness, it's mindfulness plus. And I know in the last, I would say 5 years, maybe even more than that, 10 years, mindfulness has become much more accepted in the workplace because, I think before that it was sort of like, it's again, something nice to have in a retreat center or in the large spaces, but more and more there's this greater acceptance that this is absolutely critical to how we lead and how we show up in the workplace. When I think about working with leaders and also being in that role myself a couple of times, is I will say, that the ability to understand how we choose where our attention goes, and how we choose to show up for ourselves and others, and how do we become more comfortable with what's going on inside, right, requires us to be present. And I think, and it's not so simple as in being present, just, of course, it's being present in the moment, but it's beyond that, right? It's really having choice of how do we bring our capacity to really consider what's the wisest decision in this moment that I can make, right? Because when we think about, there's more and more, like Dan Goleman, for example, who I've had the honor of working with, others have shown that technical skills will only get us so far, right? So I started my career as a consultant. I was an econ major, I was a political philosophy major, right? But learning how to mock, those are things that I learned in the workplace. And I was very fortunate to have a great environment that let me do that. And so the technical skills we can learn, we can teach. These other aspects of how do you manage yourself? How do you manage others around you? Those are all the things that are not always taught in school, right? Those aren't, and to me, one of my pet peeves is that it's called soft skills. And, my thing is, what is soft about working with human beings? What is soft about managing all the, think about all the stories we tell about ourselves, all the things that trip us up in terms of being able to make wise decisions. Because as leaders, our decisions don't just impact us. It has this huge ripple effect on all those, not just around us, but those longer term impacts years down the line.
Yeah, nothing soft there at all. And it's hard because even where to start sometimes and pulling back the layers of that onion, which is myself, right? And so difficult, the things that get in the way of me being present.
Absolutely. I love that analogy you also said about sort of peeling back the onions, right? Because there's this, interestingly, a pushback. There's been a recent article about how mindfulness is really selfish. Right. And I think this is where compassion has to come in, because I think sometimes there's this misunderstanding too, that mindfulness is, well, it's self-awareness. I'm aware of myself. And so then we can get really internal, right, about the work. But compassion really allows us to actually, it's about showing up. It's about action, right? It's about seeing this. Being mindful is sort of the root, is search inside yourself, which is started at Google, really looked at. Mindfulness is really sort of the foundation of it. Now it's how do we then use that in action, because it's not just about the internal self, but it's about how do I internally understand what's going on so that I can impact others in the world around me in a way that hopefully leaves it better than not.
You talk about centeredness, seen in your work, this idea of purposeful play as a component of centeredness. You defined it as mindfulness plus. And I can imagine that some of the clients that you work with or students are like, hey, listen, I'm a manager of people. I don't have time for play, Belinda. So what do you mean by purposeful play, and how does that equip us to, lead others and lead our organizations more effectively?
Absolutely. It's funny because that word play, and I will say, it took me probably a while to fully embrace that part of it because it's always been very important to me. But sort of, when I'm 20 something years old and, trying to be taken seriously amongst mostly, male dominated sort of, atmosphere, I wasn't going to be like, oh, that's clay. But as well, and think about sort of where we are, right? In this world where there's so much chaos, so much uncertainty, we don't know what's going to, we have no idea what's going to, like day by day, I'm like, well, it's going to show up now in the news. And a lot of times we forget to play in this, and remember, it's purposeful play. It's not playing just for the heck of like having fun, which is also important. But maybe not in the workplace. But this sense of play is critical for us to be actually be open to this chaos that is around us. And as I was saying to someone yesterday, it's not about being chaotic. As leaders, we have to actually be able to manage chaos. And in order to manage chaos, there has to be order, right? But in order to be able to play, we have to have structure. So that's why it has to be very intentional purpose, because until you you can't really experiment unless you understand your core, right? Just like you can't really sort of think about, improv. So I do study improv as well. I'm not very good at it, but I really enjoy it. But for me, improv is so important. Like I keep doing it because it keeps my skills, or I try to keep my skills, really sort of sharp in that, so that I can respond in the moment. And I always encourage any leader, take an improv class. Just take an improv class. And I remember we had one session where we would tell the leaders that it was an improv class because we say that people would run away. So we just called it a leadership session. We had so much fun, right? We had a lot of fun, but there's actually real sort of skill building around it, because there's so, and Robert Quinn, who's a professor, has really talked about these 4 fundamental states of leadership. And so much of leadership is being other focused. It's being results focused. It's really being able to play in that way of creating, innovating. And creating, innovating isn't creating something out of nothing necessarily. It's sort of taking what we have and seeing the possibilities. So that play becomes critical. And again, play is not without intention. It's intentional play, but it also enables us to also come to different situations and with people with an open mind. Because when you look at children, they don't have preconceived notions about things. They just see something, they're like, hey, let's whatever. And there's that famous study of the spaghetti with the marshmallow test, right? Where they take MBA students and they take kindergartners, and who does it better? The kindergartners, right? Because the kindergartners are like, oh, let's just figure it out. And we just have to have a strategy, and we have to think about it. And they get tripped up, right? And we all do as we get older. So part of the play is to invite us to look at things with that beginner's mind, which is connected to mindfulness, of course, and centeredness, but how we approach things with a different mind, so that I'm challenging those stories and assumptions I have about myself, I have about you have about me, right? Think about the listeners here, right? We all have stories now created already about what I'm saying, about what you're saying. We all have stories. How do I interrupt those?
Hey, thanks for listening to today's episode. If you could please rate, review, and subscribe to our podcast, we'd greatly appreciate it. And we'll see you in the next episode.